They laughed. When he used straw as fertilizer, his soil became the darkest in 3 counties. The wheat harvest came in early September of 1979. Grayson County, Kentucky. Lester Pruitt stood at the edge of Field 12, the one that ran north from the equipment shed to a line of old sycamores along a creek bed that dried up every August, and watched the straw settle behind the John Deere combine in long, pale windrows across the stubble. He was 61 years old, had been farming the same ground north of Caneyville since 1953. 26 years of wheat and corn on the same 210 acres. 160 of those acres in active crop ground, 50 in pasture and woodlot. The rest in fence rows and creek margin that nobody had ever figured out a use for. Lester had farmed it all himself except for a few weeks each spring when his nephew drove up from Bowling Green and helped with the planting. Field 12 was the northernmost piece. 40 acres of flat ground. The soil there had always been pale. The kind of pale that meant thin. 3 inches of topsoil over a layer of yellow-gray subsoil that a spade would bounce off in dry weather. Lester had farmed Field 12 for 26 years, and in that time it had given him average yields and taken his inputs without complaint. It had never surprised him in either direction. The straw windrows lay in long pale ribbons across the stubble that afternoon, catching the low September light. Lester stood beside the 966 with one hand on the front tire and looked at them. Most years, the straw was baled and sold. Martin Gentry over on the Elizabethtown Road paid $14 a bale for wheat straw, sometimes $16 in years when he needed extra bedding before winter. 11 consecutive years, Lester had run the baler through Field 12 after harvest and stacked the bales at the edge of the road for Martin Gentry to haul away. It was straightforward, consistent. The money covered the baling costs and left something over. He stood there a while longer. Then he walked back to the equipment shed, left the baler where it sat, hitched the 9-foot disc harrow to the 966, and drove it back out into the field. He ran the disc twice through the straw. First pass at 4 inches, chopping the windrows and folding them under. Second pass on the diagonal. Another 2 inches of penetration, working the chopped straw into the top 6 inches of soil. The ground came up rough and dark in the wake of the disc, the straw disappearing into it in gray-brown ribbons that turned darker where the moisture still held near the surface. By 4 in the afternoon, the windrows were gone. The field looked uneven, almost ragged compared to the clean-tilled ground that good practice preferred. Lester drove the 966 back to the shed, unhitched the disc, and washed up. Roy Castleman farmed the ground directly east of Field 12. His fence line ran the full length of the east side of the field, 40 chains of woven wire that had been there since the 1940s. Roy had seen the baler sitting idle in the shed when he drove past on the county road that morning. He had seen the disc go out, seen it come back. He didn't say anything at the time. By Thursday afternoon, the word had moved through the Grayson County Farm Supply in Caneyville. Dale Huff, who worked the parts counter, mentioned it to Lester on Friday when Lester came in for a box of hydraulic fittings. He said Roy Castleman had been in that morning and had mentioned what he'd seen. Mentioned it the way men at a farm supply counter mention things, with a specific kind of tone. Dale Huff laughed, shook his head slowly, said Roy's opinion was that incorporating wheat straw would tie up the soil nitrogen and cost Lester his entire corn crop the following year. 2 other men at the counter heard this. One of them, a cattle farmer named Dennis Prater who ran ground over near Millwood, said he'd heard the same thing from the extension office years back. Said it was one of those ideas that sounded reasonable until you tried it and lost money. Lester paid for the hydraulic fittings. Drove home. Roy Castleman was not wrong about the nitrogen. Wheat straw carries a carbon-to-nitrogen ratio of roughly 80 to 1. When soil microbes set to work decomposing it, they draw nitrogen out of the surrounding soil to fuel the process. A 40-acre field with 2 tons of straw incorporated per acre would pull between 15 and 20 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre out of the available pool. In a corn year, that was a meaningful deficit. Not ruinous on its own, but real. The kind of thing that would show in yield. Lester had spent 2 evenings in late August going through soil science bulletins from the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service before he made his decision. He had read about the nitrogen pull. He had a plan for it. In the spring of 1980, before planting Field 12 to corn, he applied an additional 22 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre above his standard rate. 40 pounds total per acre rather than the 18 he normally used. The nitrogen cost $3.80 per acre extra, $152 for the field. He wrote the amount in the black ledger he kept above the kitchen desk alongside his seed and fuel costs. Gerald Whitaker arrived in late April. He was the Grayson County Extension agent, based out of the University of Kentucky Extension office on Walnut Street in Leachfield. He had been in the county 7 years. He made his rounds to farms in the area twice a year, spring and fall, and Lester's place was on his eastern route. He walked Field 12 with Lester that afternoon. The ground was still rough from the fall to sing. In spots, partially decomposed straw was visible just under the surface, pale gray threads running through the darker soil matrix. Whitaker crouched and pinched some of the surface soil between his fingers. Rubbed it. Let it fall. He told Lester that incorporating high carbon residue into tight ground created conditions that suppressed early microbial activity rather than promoting it. He said the first 2 years of the practice would almost certainly show yield reductions. He had seen it, he said, with farmers who had experimented with no-till before the equipment existed to make it practical. The results were rarely what the theory predicted. He drove away in a Greene County pickup. The corn germinated on schedule in May of 1980. The stand was even. Color through June was acceptable. The crop tasseled on time and pollination proceeded normally through July. Lester walked the rows twice a week and made notes in the ledger. He did not see anything that alarmed him. He did not see anything that encouraged him either. The combine went through Field 12 in October of 1980. The yield monitor read 94 bushels per acre. The previous 5-year average for Field 12 had been 112 bushels per acre. At the Grayson County Farm Bureau annual meeting in November, held at the Extension office on Walnut Street, the county's crop yields were summarized by Whitaker in a brief presentation. The drought-adjusted county average for corn that year was 109 bushels per acre. Field 12 had come in at 94. Lester was in the room when the numbers were discussed. He did not raise his hand to explain the difference. On the drive home, he passed Roy Castleman's mailbox on the county road. Roy's winter wheat was already up 2 inches in the fields along the road. Clean, even, green against the brown of the surrounding ground. Field 12 sat dark and rough and empty. In September of 1980, Lester incorporated the straw again, second consecutive year. He drilled winter wheat on the field in October at 2 bushels per acre, a cover crop he intended to terminate in the spring before planting corn. The wheat came up in 3 weeks, greened thin and even across all 40 acres before the November cold settled in. Roy Castleman drove past on the county road and slowed down to look at it. Did not get out of the truck. Drove on. The winter was dry. January came in cold and stayed cold through February. The cover wheat held through it, roots reaching 4 inches into the subsoil by the time March arrived. Lester terminated it in April with a single shallow pass of the disc. just deep enough to break the stand without disturbing the straw that was still decomposing 6 inches below. He reduced his supplemental nitrogen that spring to 14 pounds per acre extra. The straw was a full year deeper into decomposition, and the microbial demand for nitrogen was easing. The 1981 corn yield from Field 12 was 108 bushels per acre. Not his best, but within range. Roy Castleman's adjacent field yielded 118 bushels that year. Lester heard this from Dale Huff at the Farm Supply in October, mentioned without particular intention, just the way numbers move in a small county. The implication traveled without being spoken. Lester bought a pair of work gloves and a quart of chain oil and drove home. The change that had been accumulating under the surface of Field 12 became visible for the first time in the fall of 1981 when Lester pulled his annual soil cores for the University of Kentucky lab test. Field 12 had returned organic matter readings between 1.4 and 1.7% in every test, since Lester had started submitting samples in 1961. The county average for continuously cropped ground in that part of Grayson County was 1.6%. Standard for the region. Standard for ground that had been worked hard without organic material being returned for 3 decades. The 1981 lab report came back showing Field 12 at 2.1% organic matter. The report sat on the kitchen desk for several days. Lester compared it against the previous year's reports, which he kept in a folder inside the ledger. 1 full percentage point of gain in 2 years. Modest in isolation. Significant against 20 years of flat readings. He filed the report and said nothing about it to anyone. In September of 1982, he incorporated the straw for the 3rd consecutive year. The disc went through easier than it had in 1979. The ground had changed. He could feel it under his boots when he walked the rows in June. A slight softness, a give in the surface that the hard-packed soil of 1979 had not had. The color was shifting too, particularly along the south edge, where the soil had always run heavier and the microbial activity had concentrated. Not dramatically darker. Darker in the way a fence post darkens when it has been standing in damp ground for a long time. Gradual enough that you would not notice it unless you were looking. The 1982 corn yield was 114 bushels per acre. He wrote it in the ledger without comment. Gerald Whitaker stopped by that November, not specifically to discuss Field 12, but because the Extension Office was running a county-wide nitrogen efficiency program and Lester's place was on his fall route. They talked for 20 minutes at the equipment shed door. Whitaker left a pamphlet about split nitrogen applications. Lester read it that evening at the kitchen table. It confirmed what he had already been doing for 2 years. The summer of 1983 was the driest in Grayson County in 22 years. Rain stopped falling in useful amounts after June 14th. By the 3rd week of July, the pastures along the county roads had gone gray-brown, the kind of dry that belonged in August, not July. By August 3rd, the official record from the National Weather Service station at the Elizabethtown Airport showed 41 consecutive days without measurable precipitation. Daytime high temperatures had reached 94 degrees or above on 23 of those 41 days. Corn across the county was rolling its leaves by 9 in the morning, curling them tight to reduce surface area, pulling every available molecule of moisture up from the root zone. Lester walked Field 12 on the morning of August 11th. He pulled a soil probe at 4 locations across the field. At 6 inches down, the ground turned on the probe with one hand. At 8 inches, the probe came out with soil still clinging to it, darker than the surface, cool to the touch. The kind of moisture that meant the ground was still holding something. He pulled a probe from Roy Castleman's adjacent field, through the fence with Roy's permission. Roy was standing at the fence line when Lester did it. The probe entered the ground stiffly and hit dry subsoil at 5 inches. White clay dust on the steel when it came back up. They stood at the fence line and looked at the two probes, Lester's dark and moist, Roy's pale and dry. Neither of them said much. The yield reports came in that October. Field 12, 102 bushels per acre. Roy Castleman's adjacent field, 44 bushels. The county corn average for 1983 came in at 53 bushels per acre, less than half the prior 5-year average. The county assessor officially designated 34% of Grayson County's corn acreage as drought crop loss. Field 12 had produced 102 bushels per acre through 41 consecutive rainless days. The phone rang 11 times in November. Not all at once. Over the course of the month. Farmers from the east side of the county where the drought damage had been worst. They had the yield figures from the crop reporting system, or had heard numbers discussed at the Farm Bureau or the elevator in Leachfield. They wanted to know what Lester had done to Field 12. He told each of them the same thing. Straw incorporated 4 consecutive years. Cover crop in the rotation. Nitrogen rate adjusted for decomposition stage. Nothing that required equipment they did not already own. Gerald Whitaker arrived in late November. He came with a young man from Lexington named Andrew Marsh, a graduate student in the Soil Science Department at the University of Kentucky. Marsh was working on a thesis about organic matter accumulation rates in continuous row crop systems. They brought stainless steel soil sampling tubes in a plastic case in the back of the county truck. They spent a full morning on Field 12. 12 sampling locations, cores taken at 4 inches, 8 inches, and 14 inches at each location. They took comparison cores from 3 neighboring farms with similar soil types. The two of them worked methodically across the field without much conversation. Marsh wrote measurements and observations in a yellow waterproof notebook. Whitaker carried the sample bags. When they finished, Marsh stood at the south edge of the field near the sycamore tree line and looked back across the 40 acres. He did not say anything specific. He picked up a handful of loose surface soil and let it fall through his fingers. It fell in loose clumps, dark, the way soil with organic structure falls when it is not compacted. The lab results from the University of Kentucky Soil Testing Lab came back in January of 1984. Field 12, 4.3% organic matter. The 3 comparison farms averaged 1.5%. The 3-county average for Grayson, Ohio, and Breckinridge counties, which Marsh had compiled from extension records going back to 1968, was 1.6%. In 4 years of incorporating straw, Field 12 had moved from 1.7% organic matter to 4.3%. In a region where the county average had not moved meaningfully in 15 years of extension service monitoring, Whitaker drove out to the farm in February. He came inside. They sat at the kitchen table, and Whitaker laid the lab report between them on the oilcloth. He did not apologize for the conversation at the fence line in April 1980. He said it was the highest organic matter reading his office had recorded in 14 years of monitoring Grayson County soil. He said he would like to include the information in the county extension newsletter if Lester was willing to be referenced. Lester said he would think about it. The newsletter article ran in April 1984. A half page. No photographs. The headline read, Organic Matter Management in Western Kentucky Row Crop Systems. One Grayson County farm was described as an example. Lester's name did not appear at his request. Roy Castleman read the article. He recognized the yield figures from the 1983 drought reports. He drove over on a Saturday morning in late April and stood in the equipment shed doorway while Lester worked on the disc harrow's bearing assembly. He wanted to know the full method. All of it. Nitrogen rates, disc depths, timing, cover crop varieties. Lester put down the wrench and told him. It took about 20 minutes. Roy wrote on a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. He did not say he had been wrong at the fence line in September of 1979. Roy Castleman was not a man who said things like that, but he drove home and put the paper on his own kitchen table, and in September of 1984, he incorporated the straw from his eastern fields rather than baling it. Lester noticed, didn't mention it. By the fall of 1984, 5 other farms in the county had begun incorporating straw. One of them was a 600-acre operation east of Leachfield that had been in the same family since the 1890s. The farm manager called Whitaker's office, asking questions. Whitaker gave him Lester's number. Lester spent 40 minutes on the phone one evening explaining the nitrogen management piece, which was the part most people got wrong in the first year. Andrew Marsh published his thesis in the spring of 1986. The Grayson County case study occupied the second chapter. The farm was identified only as a western Kentucky row crop operation. The organic matter accumulation rate documented on Field 12 was the highest recorded across 217 farms surveyed in the 3-county region. Field 12, 40 acres. Pale ground in 1979. The highest measured organic matter in a 3-county survey by 1986. Lester's soil testing continued. The readings from Field 12 showed 4.3% in 1984, 4.8% in 1985, and 5.1% in 1986. The color of the soil in Field 12 had changed from the pale brown-gray Lester had always known to something he described in the ledger only as dark. Along the south edge near the sycamore tree line, where the soil ran heaviest and the microbial population had built the densest, the surface inch registered almost black on the Munsell soil color chart that Marsh had left in the equipment shed. The chart put it at 10YR21. Very dark brown, the notation said, tipping toward black. The drought of 1988 came through the county hard in late July. 27 consecutive days without rain. Daytime temperatures reaching 96 degrees in the second week of August. The county corn average that year came in at 61 bushels per acre. Field 12 yielded 97 bushels per acre. Whitaker drove out in September with a camera this time. He stood in Field 12 and pushed a spade into the ground with 1 foot. It went 8 inches on a single push. He stood looking at what came up on the spade blade for a moment before he took the photograph. Dark soil, loose, holding its shape when he pressed it between his fingers. The smell of it was different from the pale ground he had examined in 1980. Richer, the way creek bottom soil smells after a slow rain. He took the photograph and drove back to Leachfield. The method held through the years without significant change. Lester extended it to Fields 7, 9, and 15 by 1990. All of them had carried the same pale, tight topsoil in 1979. By 1992, the 4 fields together averaged 4.6% organic matter. The county average that year, when Whitaker's office ran a comprehensive survey, came in at 1.7%. Dennis Prater, the cattle farmer from Millwood, who had agreed with Roy Castleman at the farm supply counter in 1979, stopped by in the summer of 1991. He had retired from row crop farming himself. He walked Field 12 with Lester one evening in July, the corn waist-high and dark green. He picked up a handful of surface soil at the row edge and held it for a while without saying anything. He had been thinking about putting a few acres into vegetables, he said. Wanted ground that would hold moisture. Wanted to know if Lester thought Field 12 would suit. Lester told him it would. Lester Pruitt farmed Field 12 until 1997. He retired that year, 3 weeks after his 79th birthday. He had been farming the same 210 acres for 44 years. He sold the property in March to a young couple named Hargrove from Elizabethtown, who were transitioning out of suburban nursery work and wanted ground suited to vegetable production without heavy chemical inputs. Before they closed, the county extension office directed them specifically to the Pruitt farm. Whitaker, in his final year before his own retirement, had told them about Field 12 over the phone. He gave them the soil test numbers, the drought performance history, the yield records from 1979 through 1996. Lester walked the property with the Hargroves before the papers were signed. When they reached Field 12, he pushed the old spade into the ground at the south edge near the sycamore tree line. 8 inches. One push through dark, loose ground that smelled of the creek bottom after a slow rain. He left the spade standing in the soil and let the Hargroves look at it. They did not need the numbers explained. The Hargroves still farmed the ground, vegetables now, not commodity grain. The organic matter reading from the last University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension soil test, submitted in the spring of 2009, came back at 5.6%. The highest reading ever recorded on the property. The highest reading submitted from the county in that testing cycle. Andrew Marsh is a professor of soil science at the University of Kentucky. He teaches undergraduate soil management in the spring semester. The Grayson County case study appears in the second chapter of his course materials. Still anonymous. Still just a number on a chart. The organic matter accumulation rate documented in that case study is the reference point he uses for what continuous straw incorporation can produce in western Kentucky soils over a decade of consistent practice. The black ledger is in the Hargrove farmhouse. They found it in the house when they moved in, on the shelf above the kitchen desk. They kept it. They still look at it sometimes in winter, reading the annual yield entries in Lester's careful handwriting, the nitrogen rates, the disc depth notes, the soil test numbers climbing year by year from 1.7 to 2.1 to 4.3 to 5.1. The International 966 tractor that pulled the disc harrow through Field 12 on that September afternoon in 1979 is in the equipment shed. Newer machines beside it, but the old one still there, paint faded and cab worn, the hydraulic lines replaced twice since 1979. The ground is still dark, still holds moisture the way good ground does, deep into a dry summer. Still produces without the inputs that the pale soil of 1979 required. Lester Pruitt knew it would take time. Put the straw in anyway. Kept putting it in, year after year, in a field that everyone in the county knew was thin and pale and not capable of much. They found out otherwise.